Hi, I'm Lisa from Lori's Country Cottage. Welcome to How Tuesday. Today, I'm going to talk about how to decide how much fabric to buy if you don't know what you're going to make out of it. Join me. Sometimes as quilters, we go into a quilt shop and we see fabric we love, but we're not sure what we're going to make out of it, but we really need to buy it. So I polled the staff at Lori's Country Cottage and I asked them this question. If you see a piece of fabric or a line of fabric in a quilt shop that you love, but you don't know what you're going to make, how much do you buy? So here's what they told me. Usually your main fabric, the print that you love, you're going to put it in your quilt as well as using it for a border. If we're talking about a 90 by 90 quilt, you'll need 1.5 meters for that outside border and at least 1.5 meters for inside your quilt. Most of the staff said they don't buy less than 1 meter ever. If you don't know what you're doing with it, better to be safe than sorry. Remember when you're picking out fabrics that you need to purchase your binding when you're doing it and think about your borders. Sometimes it's hard to pick out border fabric before you have your quilt top together. So if you don't know, you might end up picking out 2 fabrics and make your choice at the end. I'll give you some tips and tricks what to do with your leftover fabric later on in the video. All right, the other thing you need to think about is how many fabrics are you purchasing? If you're buying 8 or 9 different prints from a line, you don't need 2 meters of each, that's for sure. So let's look at some fabrics and I'll go through some decision-making processes that I use when I'm buying fabric. Let's start with Dandy Duo. This is a great line of fabric. It's got 3 main prints, one with a dark gray background, one with light gray, and one with the corally peach color. Then it's got some great printed coordinates, a medium-sized print, and some small prints. It's really good to vary the size of the prints of the fabrics that you purchase. And then great tone-on-tone coordinates. So if I were to pick out fabric for a quilt, I would start by choosing which of the main fabrics I want to showcase. Let's say I chose the one with the dark gray background. So I'm going to need at least 3 meters of that. That's going to be my outside border, at least 1.5 meters for the inside of the quilt, because I don't know what I'm doing. I know I'm going to want this dark print because it's the coordinate to that. It may play a significant part in my quilt if I'm going to frame blocks or do sashing. So I'm going to need at least 2 meters. Probably I would buy 2.5 meters of that. I might choose a smaller cut of the large print, but I think I would probably go with these printed coordinates and I'd take 1.5 meters of each one. Now, we can take a chance with our plains or tone-on-tones, the green, gray, mustard, and coral color, and the darker coral. I could wait and just, when I decide what I'm doing with the quilt, hope to find something in at Lori's that coordinates, but you know what? These are such a perfect match. I'm going to pick 2 or 3 and I'm going to get 1.5 meters of each one of those. So Dandy Duo also has pre-cuts. So there's a layer cake. Now in a layer cake, you're going to get really good variety of fabric, but what are you going to do? I'm going to pick whichever fabric I want for the border of this quilt. I don't know what this quilt is, but I need to pick out a border. So I'm going to choose my favorite print and I'm going to get at least 2 meters of that. So I can put it inside the quilt as well and have my 1.5 meters for the outside border. I'm also going to choose my base fabric, the fabric that's going to tie everything together. So if I'm going to use a layer cake and I choose the green color, my quilt is going to have a green tone to it. If I choose the dark coral, it's going to look more coral. If I choose the dark gray, my quilt will look more gray. So there is a point where you have to make a decision what color your quilt's going to be. And I would definitely buy my coordinate at that time. And I'm going to buy at least 2 meters, probably 2.5, because it's probably going to be a narrow inside border if I want to use it for sashing, inside or frame my blocks. I'm going to make sure I have enough. Same thing with a jelly roll quilt. If you're going to use a jelly roll, it gives you all that great variety in prints, but you need something to pull it all together. So at some point, there's a point where you need to decide what color your quilt's going to be, and I would buy the coordinate at that time. So that's Dandy Duo. Let's move to another line of fabric, and I'll show you how you might pick out fabric for that. Okay, here's a completely different line of fabric. It's very muted, not much color. It's very neutral. So there is one kind of main print, a larger print. The rest are all very small scale prints. This is kind of a medium. So I think this quilt's going to look very different. This is going to be a soft and muted quilt unless I add a pop of color, but it does have the cream color base. So I might have a hard time, you know, throwing a green or a blue in here. I'm probably going to pick this caramel color, and I'm going to use that as an accent. So this is a nice line of fabric where I might consider buying a ½ meter of everything. That gives me 2 fat quarters of each fabric, and I might choose a fat quarter quilt for something like this. But I'm going to make sure I buy enough of the accent color that I don't have to go looking later. Also, just a little note on grays. Grays are sometimes really hard to match up. So if there is a gray fabric in the line of fabric that matches the line, I always buy the gray right there. I never wait to find something else. Let's take a look at another one. Here's Xanadu by Anne Lauer. The line of fabric has 2 large prints as main prints, and then also a medium-sized print that's multicolored, and the same print just in purple and teal, medium size. This is a wild print, but I definitely want that in the quilt. That's got all the colors. It's going to pull everything together. It comes in black and white. So I have 2 choices. I can decide I'm going to make a black background quilt just by this main print, then stick with the black background fabrics and then add some coordinates to it. Or I can decide I'm going to put both of them in, and it's going to be a black, white, and teal purple quilt. So let's use that scenario. All right, I don't know what I'm doing. I have 2 main prints. I think I pretty much need to pick my border fabric first, and I'm going with this bad boy. I love this fabric. I think that's so awesome. So he's going to be my outside border, plus I'm definitely going to put it in the quilt. So 3 meters of this one. And then I need at least 1.5 meters of each of these. That gives me 3 meters of main fabric for the inside. Now, that's a pretty busy set of fabrics. I'm definitely going to want to put this multi-print in, unless I decide I'm making a purple quilt or a teal quilt. So if I decide, oh, this is for someone who loves teal, maybe I'll choose this one instead of this. And I'm going to need 1.5 meters, 2 meters of that. The tone-on tones for this line, I could probably wait and find matching fabrics later on, but I love the squares in the fabric. They match this outside border, so I'm getting 1.5 meters of each of those. Now, binding. So I've got my outside border. What am I going to bind it in? I love to bind my quilts with a dark binding. It puts a nice frame on. So I'm probably going to head over to the black section and find a plain black for binding. Then I think it might be a narrow inside border as well. So I'm going to make sure I buy at least 1.5 meters of black. Now, Xanadu also comes with jelly rolls, so the same rules apply. The jelly rolls have more colors. There's more pink in here and a few more prints. There's a more plummy purple in here. So I'm going to make sure I pick out coordinates that are going to complement the jelly roll and make it the color I want. Do I want purple, teal, or this lovely green, or am I going to make it mostly black? So I'll make that decision and then purchase accordingly. All right, let's head over to a smaller line of fabric and see what to do when you only have a few choices. Let's talk about a smaller line of fabric. Here's a small line of fabric with kind of 2 main prints. This one's pretty light, so I don't think I'd use it for an outside border, but I'd certainly put it in my quilt. So I need at least 1.5 meters. I'm thinking 2 meters of that because it's really useful. Probably going to choose one of these two for my outside border. So whichever one I choose, I need 1.5 meters for the outside border, plus fabric for inside the quilt. So at least 2.5, probably 3 meters. And then the other ones, I'm going to take 1.5 meters. That gives me enough to play with. Now let's say I'm on a budget and I don't want to buy my background fabric today. I could always leave this neutral out and just purchase those. Speaking of background fabrics, if you're buying a background fabric for your quilt, you need between 3 and 5 meters if you're making a nice queen size quilt. So if you see fabric on sale and you want to buy it for the background of a quilt, make sure you get 3 to 5 meters. You'd hate to run out halfway through. Now let's look at our great coffee fabric. This is a little bit challenging when I'm picking out fabric for a quilt. What am I going to use? The scale of the print on most of them is quite similar. They're all going to read the same in the quilt. So I'm probably going to just pick my favorite print. Let's say it's this one. I'm going to use it as the focus of my quilt, and then I'm going to buy something that has more background in it, this light one or the black one, even this one, but it needs something to calm it down. So I'm definitely going to pick out a tone-on-tone black, red, even the nice caramely color to go with it. And I'm going to need, I don't know, I might be using sashing, at least 2 meters of that calming fabric that I'm going to buy to go with this. I'm going to need 3 meters, you know, of the print I want. And then I might, for this, just pick up 1 meter of a couple of the ones I want. I don't necessarily buy the whole line. I think it might be a little bit mishmashy if I put all this fabric into a quilt without any calming presence. Okay, we're going to head over to a panel and talk about what to do if you're going to make a quilt with a panel. We've been talking about large size quilts, 90 by 90, even bigger. Panel quilts usually aren't that big because sometimes they look lopsided if you don't do a lot of piecing with that panel in the middle. It's a small center. So let's say we're working on a smaller scale, a large lap size or a twin. Your panel pretty much goes in the middle unless you do an off-sided quilt, which you certainly can do. We've got some great prints with the moose on top. I definitely want that in. Now it's directional. Oh, what am I going to do with a directional print? All right, let's say I want to use a directional print in the border of my quilt. Well, I don't want my moose laying on its side. I want my moose standing up and down. So I need to buy the length of my quilt in that fabric. Well, I don't know how big it's going to be. Well, you need to buy 90 inches so that you have for sure the length of your quilt. Remember, if you're mitering borders, you need extra. The width of your quilt, the width of your border twice added to the length for any directional borders. So if I was going to buy this panel and use this as a border, I would choose some of these prints, probably 1.5 meters of a couple of them, but we need to add something to tone this down to separate our blocks. So I'm going to go to the color wall and I'm going to pick up at least 1 meter of some coordinates. Here's another word on panels. Don't forget, if you want to do a one block wonder using a panel, make sure you have 7 panels. A bit more about purse making as well. If you're picking up wax canvas or vinyl or cork, I always buy the biggest roll I can because I'm going to use it for handles. And I prefer not to piece my handles, but if you're using it for the outside of the bag and not using handles, you can probably go with a 1/2 meter. Normally I buy a yard or 1 meter, however it comes, so that I know I have enough. Don't forget, 3-yard quilts are a great way to help you decide how much fabric to buy. You need 3 yards. Unless you want to do double fold binding, make sure you buy that extra yard. Having said that, you only get to use 3 fabrics. So if there's a full line and you like them all, it's a little bit limiting. Also, when you're in the fabric store and you think, oh, I don't know what I want to make. Hey, I have this quilt pattern at home, but I don't know what it calls for. Don't be afraid to look on the internet for the pattern. Usually pattern designers will post a picture of the back of the pattern so you can see how much fabric you need. All right, now you've purchased your fabric for the quilt and you have leftovers. What do? Well, sometimes that happens when you're just buying fabric and you didn't have a plan. I like to incorporate extra fabric into the backing of my quilt. Why not use it up? I also like multicolored binding. So you can piece your leftovers and do your binding multicolored, or do two-color binding, and that uses your fabric as well. You can make a pillowcase to match the quilt, or even a dresser runner. Well, I hope the staff at Lori's have helped you decide how much fabric to buy when you're not sure what you're going to make. When you come into the store, ask us. We'll help you out. Thanks for joining me for How Tuesday today.